Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Paul and Susie show. Brief
Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Brief introductions. We're both had quite long corporate careers. We've both done lots of work in other countries. We've both written some books. If you'd like to know more about us, then we're both on LinkedIn, and it's got our photos on there, so you'll know it's us. So today we're going to talk about The Wise Leader. This is a book that Susie and I have almost finished writing. It will come out through Routledge at the beginning of next year. We're going to share some ideas with you, and then we've got a nice big exercise to do, which we'll do in small groups. So The Wise Leader. Both Susan and I work in the leadership industry and have done for about 20 years. And our own observations are that leaders, as the world gets more complex, many leaders are struggling, and leadership programs, or many leadership programs, don't seem to be helping very much. Those leadership programs tend to be focused on, not always, but they tend to be focused on competencies, competency frameworks, when the complexity literature and contemporary change theory tells us that that's not enough, that we either need something different or we need something additional. We see world leaders struggling. I'm from the UK originally, and watching what's going on in the UK right now, you kind of scratch your head. What the wisdom literature tells us is that intelligence, IQ, is not enough in leadership. And empathy is really important, but empathy isn't enough either. And so where else do we go looking for some insights in terms of how can we be better, more effective leaders, and how can we help leaders to become more effective? And so we went looking to the world of wisdom. And the world of wisdom, it talks about reasoning ability and judgment. That's kind of intelligence. It talks about emotional regulation, compassion, and empathy. But there's other stuff in there as well that's sitting in the wisdom literature. The challenge with the wisdom literature is that it's pretty intellectual, and it's not always obvious how to operationalize some of these materials, like desire to serve the common good, for example. Some people talk about that as a personality trait. How do we operationalize that? And so that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years, is taking the wisdom literature and playing around also with the leadership literature, particularly the psychological aspects of leadership, to come up with an approach that's practical, that offers us some practical guidance in terms of how to help leaders become wiser. From that exercise emerged 5 mantras. So we're simplifying these 5 mantras. Firstly, reflective learning. And a lot of the reflective learning stuff is based on Susie's research, her PhD research on reflection, where she found out that effective leaders don't just reflect, but they reflect differently. Second mantra is know yourselves. Notice we're talking about knowing yourselves, not just know yourself. I'm going to talk, and that's the mantra that we're going to talk most about in this session. Transcend yourselves. So once I've understood myself, how do I kind of step aside from myself in order to be able to navigate all of the relationships that I need to navigate as a leader? Think meta is about how we think about change and different ways of thinking about change. And dialogue is really wisdom in action. How, if I was a fly on the wall, how would I see a wise leader engaging in conversation? Another way of thinking about these 5 mantras is some myths, some of the myths that we see in leadership, and Susie's going to talk about those now.
Thank you, Paul. So as Paul said, that work on the wisdom literature and bringing it together with the psychology of leadership has really led us to busting a few of the myths that are prevalent in leadership development at the moment. The first one being, as Paul said, what sits in the middle of our wisdom, the wise leader model, is really committing to reflective learning. And you can see there the myth around, that we need to get leaders just to reflect more. As Paul said, my PhD research was really clear that leaders with strong self-belief, the ones that are really operating effectively, are reflect very differently to leaders that don't have the same level of self-belief. So it's about not just the amount of reflection that leaders are doing, but what they are focusing on. Specific topics that are relevant to leadership emerged in my research. And this sits at the heart of how we are attempting to make wisdom more accessible to leaders, really giving them some guidelines around what quality reflection can look like, and how to access that. So that's the first one. It's not just about reflecting more, it's actually about what they reflect on and how they reflect. The second one that Paul alluded to is we talk a lot about authenticity, and for both of us having been in the industry for more than 20 years each, we're challenging the notion of authenticity about knowing your one true self. Again, if we look at not just the wisdom literature, but what comes out of the psychology literature, is that the concept that we are many selves, that if we think about the different roles that we play as a leader, a manager, a daughter, a partner, a friend, as an example, those sorts of roles, challenge us to think differently about which of myselves are showing up in that role, and how do I bring the right self into the right context. So we will talk more about redefining authenticity, which Paul will do later in this presentation. The next one we want to really challenge is the leader as hero. And I think we have been challenging that from a leadership point of view when we think of all the moves towards distributed leadership and shared leadership models. Our take on that is slightly different. As you can see, we're talking about this idea of transcending all of those selves, of recognizing that actually ourselves are co-created through the relationships that we are in. So coming to terms with understanding how those selves have emerged, and then being able to step back and be able to put those selves down in service of others. So transcending yourselves is a key strategy we'll talk about as well. The fourth one that we really want to challenge is this idea of this individualistic notion of leadership, that the leader has to be the smartest person in the room. And really, the Think Meta piece that emerged in our research is about recognizing that wise leaders think about change very differently. They move beyond self, they move beyond others, and they take this meta perspective, really looking broadly and more systemically regarding themselves and others in terms of leadership. And then the last one, which we saw in the opening of this virtual conference today, room for dialogue. And Paul said it a moment ago, the idea that actually doing dialogue, doing it well, being able to manage ourselves in that dialogue, being able to really listen for identity and influence and voice respectfully, is our real message around wisdom walking. The idea that we can bring wisdom to life through the ways that we are able to do dialogue. So each of those myths really speak to us making wisdom more accessible for leaders today. Thank you, Paul. The next part you'll see as we go through this presentation, and certainly in the book, is that we're really intentional about, first of all, challenging the myths that prevail as I've just taken you through, and then providing the theory that sits behind our thinking. I mean, one of the things that's most important to recognize is that everything we're sharing with you today is absolutely evidence-based. And that's important so that leaders know that it's translatable from one context to another. The other thing we'll talk about in those 5 mantras is how that applies to leaders' self-development. Again, as I said earlier, how do we make it really practical and accessible for leaders in times of crisis to access the wisest parts of themselves? It's a real passion for ours that we are articulating in the book. And then the other part, as you would all know, is the importance of our ability to design those interventions at an organizational or systemic level. So we really provide an OD lens in terms of suggesting ways in which organizations can bring this to life. So Paul, back to you.
Cool. Thanks, Suze. So there's a lot of ground there, the 5 mantras. And so today, we don't want to just talk at you for 80 minutes. We want to do something more interactive. And so we've chosen to focus on one of those mantras for today. And the mantra that we're focusing on is know yourselves. The myth around know yourselves, as Susie said, is this idea that we have one true self. The evidence such as it is, and the evidence here is not conclusive, but the evidence such as it is says that we are many, that we comprise multiple selves. And if that's the case, that has significant consequences for this whole idea of self-awareness and significant consequences for OD professionals and other people designing leadership programs. We'll look at one piece of evidence that suggests that we are many. And this was a study done by Gazzaniga and his colleagues. And essentially what this research tells us is that on the left-hand side of the brain, we have our verbal cells, verbal and conscious. On the right-hand side of the brain, we have non-verbal cells. We have other cells that don't have a voice, that aren't always conscious, and that our cells are distributed across the 2 sides of the brain. Gazzaniga illustrated this by basically cutting the links between the 2 halves of the brain. And obviously he didn't do that as a little experiment in itself. He did that because cutting the connections between the 2 halves of the brain actually helps with severe epilepsy. So what he was able to do was to show the left-hand side of the brain and the right-hand side of the brain different sets of pictures. And by obviously covering eyes and so on, he could show the left-hand side of the brain images that the right-hand side of the brain couldn't see. And he could show the right-hand side of the brain images that the left-hand side of the brain couldn't see. So in the first instance, he showed the right-hand side of the brain, big picture of snowdrift, and then gave the right-hand side of the brain 4 little pictures to choose from. Which of the little pictures goes best with the big picture? Now, the individual wasn't asked to voice that choice. They were asked simply to point to the right little picture. And the right-hand side of the brain saw the snowdrift and usually picked the shovel, obviously shoveling snow. Then he showed the left-hand side of the brain picture of a chicken foot, and again gave the left-hand side of the brain a choice as to which of the pictures match the chicken foot, and in this case the obvious one to pick is the chicken head. Now then he asked the patient verbally, why did you pick the shovel? Now, the left-hand side of the brain is the part that's conscious and speaks, but the left-hand side of the brain didn't see the snowdrift. And so the left-hand side of the brain actually doesn't know why it picked the shovel. But what we tend to do is confabulate. We make up a story. And so the patient tended to make up a story, like, for example, I picked the shovel to clean the chicken shed. So this was evidence that our cells are distributed across the brain, and that when our brain actually is properly connected, there's all sorts of movement of information going on between the 2. And when the left hand, what he called the left hemisphere interpreter, the part of the brain that could speak, when it was answering questions, a lot of the time, the answers that it's giving are being informed by other parts of the brain. Our sense of selves are distributed. And that's just one piece of evidence that supports the idea that we have multiple aspects of self. If that all sounded a little bit highfalutin, just ask yourselves questions like this. Do you ever refer to yourself as we? If so, who's we? Do you ever hear yourself asking yourself, why did I do that? in which case, which part of you did do it and which part of you is asking why that part of you did it? Do you find yourself talking to yourself? If so, who's talking to who? Do you find your tone or accent changing in different contexts? My mother was from Yorkshire, which in the UK, where they speak with a very broad accent. At the time when she was kind of going to uni and getting a job, it was not cool to have a northern accent if you were working down south. So her accent, and I always remember her accent as being very southern, because her mother, even though they were very poor actually, they gave her elocution lessons so she could talk in a southern accent, except when she'd had a few to drink, when her accent changed, and so did her personality seem to change. A bit like number two, do you look at things you've written in the past and wondered, what was I thinking? And do you find yourself caught sometimes between two courses of action? I want to do this or I want to do this. In which case, which part of you wants to do this and which part of you wants to do that? So there's some more kind of colloquial evidence in support of us being multiple. The only evidence really that there's just one of us is our own intuitive sense of self. But also, when we think about it, people do resonate. For most people, not everyone, this idea of multiplicity does resonate. And there have been studies done mostly with students, and those students have tended to identify anywhere between about 3 and the sort of top of the bell curve is about 3 to 6 cells. Some people, one person came up with the Knights of the Round Table and identified 12 cells. So the evidence, such as it is, tends to lean more towards the idea that we're multiple than there's just one of us. Why does that matter in the leadership space? Here's a little story about Crazy John and the Aggressive Librarian. So this was a real coaching assignment that we did. And the context was that the person who was being coached had risen through the ranks really quickly and was now on the senior leadership team. He'd risen through the ranks because he came up with all these brilliant ideas that generated revenue. So now he's on the senior leadership team, but things weren't going so well because he was turning up to senior leadership team meetings and it was just very random. And he'd say, yeah, this month we're going to do this and we're going to do this. And he came back to the next senior leadership team meeting in about a month's time and they'd say, well, how did you go with that and that? And you go, oh no, we decided not to do that. Now we're doing this and this. And this isn't how senior leadership teams tend to operate. And some of the other divisional heads were getting a bit frustrated because they were focusing their own actions, so like some of the support roles, onto what he said he was trying to achieve, but what he said he was trying to achieve was shifting and changing, and people were getting very frustrated with him. In coaching, what emerged over this, I'm going to shorten like a 10-month conversation into about 2 minutes, but what emerged was he identified within himself this self that he called Crazy John. And Crazy John was sunshine yellow and was extrovert and came up with all these creative new ideas. He also identified the aggressive librarian, and the aggressive librarian knew exactly how to manage the senior leadership team, was organized, was very structured. He had that self within him. But through the conversation, what emerged was Crazy John was the one with the energy, the aggressive librarian. If Crazy John just went off on a new idea, would just go, okay, over to you. I just can't be bothered. And that was what was happening at senior leadership team meetings. They were turning up. Crazy John was the one with the energy, so the aggressive librarian just sat back. The purpose of coaching that emerged was for the coachee to understand better Crazy John and the aggressive librarian, number one, and number two, to help them collaborate more effectively, which is what happened. And by the end of the assignment, the aggressive librarian was running the show with the senior leadership team and things were going a lot better. So that's one way, or an example of how this notion of multiplicity can be useful in the coaching context. Let's talk about 360 feedback. This is a study we've just completed. It's going to be published in December, I think. And this was a piece of research we did on 360 feedback with Rod, not his real name. And so Rod had undertaken a conventional online 360 survey fairly recently, which he found kind of quite interesting, but we wanted to approach it differently. And so we went and interviewed face-to-face conversation, 4 of the people who had rated Rod. And we asked some slightly different questions. So the first question we asked all of the interviewees was, in what different contexts have you experienced Rod? Most people came up with 3 or 4 different contexts, like me and him when we're just having a relaxed one-to-one, him in a client meeting, him presenting to the board, whatever. So in what different contexts have you experienced Rod, and how did you experience Rod in each of those contexts? And what emerged from those 4 interviews was a total of 7 different contexts. And so we read them, then we met with Rod again, and we read back to Rod, this is how you, we didn't say so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that. We just summated all of this data and we said, here's the 7 contexts. Here's how people experience you in this context. Here's how they experience you in that context. Here's how they experience you in that context. And without us prompting, we didn't talk to him about multiplicity at all. He started to talk about his different selves. He talked about his commercially aware self that showed up in the client meeting, his client-facing self, his protective self, his managing self, and his committed self. And he started to characterize each of those selves. Now, this is actually really quite important, we think, in the use of 360 feedback tools, because many of us have been kind of taught, indirectly or directly, that the purpose of a 360 is to help people get clearer on their single, one, true, authentic self, and to kind of push away the other selves. So some of these tools, sometimes they say, this is you in a work environment, this is you in the home environment. And we say, yeah, okay, so that self that's showing up in the home environment, is that your authentic self? And how do you bring that authentic self to work? In other words, kind of getting rid of some of these other aspects of self. How do you be your single, true, authentic self? Which now the multiplicity approach says that's actually quite counterproductive. And there's evidence that suggests, actually, some evidence suggests that in 1/3 of cases, people undertaking these conventional 360s find that they're actually diminished their performance, not enhanced their performance. From a multiplicity lens, this says we should not be looking to get people to identify one single authentic self. We should be helping them identify all their different aspects of self and help them work out how to bring which aspect of self to what particular context in a way that's going to be most useful. We need to help them to be adaptable and agile. So it's a fundamentally different way of thinking, which actually would lead us to approach 360 feedback fundamentally differently. So that's our kind of brief background on multiplicity. What we'd like to do now, both of you, is to invite you to do an exercise. Now, I'm going to introduce that exercise, because what we're going to ask you to do is to start playing around with this idea of multiplicity and start to identify within yourself what may be some of the multiple parts of me. Now, there's 2 ways of doing this. One way, which is the simpler way, I'm going to illustrate in a moment. And then the other way, we've got a little handout in the chat room, and I'll explain what that's all about in a minute. Now, option number 1 is you simply have a think about yourself. The way into this typically is to think about yourself in different roles and start to think, well, which parts of self might coexist within myself? When I did that, I came up with 6 different selves or different voices. Number 1, driving Paul. This is the part of me that, if it's going to be talking to me, it says, yeah, let's do it. Gets things done. That's what driving Paul is motivated by. Playful Paul is experimental and says, why don't you do this? Why don't we do that? Is motivated to have fun and innovate. Loving Paul is the part that's most likely to just focus in on how someone's feeling in the moment, ask them how's they're feeling, and is motivated to support others. Tired Paul, I need to be alone. And again, this part, I don't want to push this part away. If Tired Paul's speaking up, I need to listen to Tired Paul, because Tired Paul helps me to recover. Really important, especially these days. Focus Paul is really quite quiet and is watching what's going on all the time, is probably the part within me that's most motivated to really learn. And self-critic, Paul. Most of us, I'm not going to say all of us, because I don't know that to be true, but most of us have got an inner critic, which talks to me saying, oh, what are you doing wrong here? What are you doing wrong? And serves a useful purpose. It helps me to avoid danger. So this exercise that we're about to ask you to do, you may simply want to identify your different selves. You're hypothesizing. We're only going to be spending about 20, 25 minutes on this. This is a bit of a journey, but have a first go at identifying some of those cells. Now, if you have time, what you might also choose to do is have a think about how those cells best work together. So this is now Paul, a leader, wanting to coach one of his people. My different cells need to dance. They need to learn to dance. They need to get to know each other, not ignore each other, and work out how to best collaborate. Exactly like Crazy John and the aggressive librarian needed to do. So if I'm going to coach one of my people, and I'm busy, it's in the middle of a really busy day, driving Paul is just on steroids and doing. I need to be really purposeful about which cells I bring to that conversation. And the first thing I want to make sure is focus Paul is there. Sometimes I need to take a deep breath just to get focus Paul awake, to observe and quietly steer what's going on. Loving Paul, we want loving Paul to show up first, because loving Paul needs to connect with the person who I'm coaching and create that safe space where they feel that I'm interested and feel like it's worth them sharing what's on their mind. Playful Paul will then come in, because Playful Paul wants to help the coachee explore different options. You know, especially when we're busy, we tend to be locked into this one thing, one pathway. No, I want to help you explore different options. Let's get creative. All the time, we need to keep driving Paul, who's the one that's really driving the workday, just to one side. We might bring him in at the end when we're talking about intentions. So driving Paul might step in and say, right, we've had a nice conversation. What are you actually going to do next? What's your commitment? We don't want self-critic Paul showing up if the conversation doesn't go too well. We want loving Paul to reconnect with the person on coaching, just to work out how best to navigate. We don't want self-critical Paul just kind of hijacking the whole process by going, oh, this is going really badly. Similarly, tired Paul, speak up before sessions, in between sessions, but we don't want you like getting really tired during a conversation, so you start to lose focus on the other person. So I've talked about 6 different aspects of me and helping those cells dance together in the most effective way in any given context. Now, in the chat room, oh no, so I was going to talk about this. Yeah, just the learning to dance piece again. This term authenticity, this is what we're challenging. And Avolio is a really well-known author in the leadership space, says, yeah, the term authenticity implies that one acts in accord with a true self. As I said, we challenged that. Mary Watkins said one aspect of healthy psychological development is the progressive elaboration of different internal characters and the continuous enhancement of imaginary conversations between those characters. So if you're doing that, you're not going mad, you're actually engaging in what Mary Watkins calls healthy psychological development. And what does that mean? As we get to know those different selves and they get to know each other, then everyone's pulling in the same direction, versus the more conventional approach where we focus in on this one self and ignore all the other cells. And so the cells are not working together because of our misplaced focus on trying to identify the one true self. So as I said, in the exercise that we're about to do, you may just give character to your different cells, draw little pictures. Option number 1, option number 2, if you have time, think about how they might dance together. Your third option is to go into the chat room and access the handout. The handout talks about the longer process that is outlined in the book, a process that typically will take you more than 20, 25 minutes. It has 9 steps to it. In the handout, you'll see we've covered just 6 of those steps because the middle 3 steps are actually related to the self-transcendence mantra. You may remember we had reflection, we had know yourselves, transcend yourselves. In the get to know yourselves, we focus really on these 6 steps, and that's all detailed in the handout. So your options here, we're going to give you a good 25 minutes. Your options are, number 1, just think about your different cells and draw them, start to characterize them. That's option number 1. Option number 2, if you have time, is then think about a particular situation. I talked about coaching, might be having a difficult conversation or influencing. How might your different cells best dance together to achieve best outcome? Or option 3, start working your way through the 6 steps on the handout. Entirely up to you. Okay, and that's where I think, yeah, we'll turn off the stop share. So now this exercise requires you to, as I said, have some of those the quite personal conversations. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms for this. So it's not going to be recorded. You're going to have an entirely confidential conversation for about 25 minutes. We'll then bring you back in the room and invite you to share whatever's on your mind, having had a go at this. If it makes no sense to you whatsoever, please share that with us. As I said, in the studies that people have done, most people identify somewhere between 3 to 6 cells. Some people don't get beyond 1, and the rest of it doesn't make any sense. So come back and share your experiences. Any questions at all before we put you into breakout rooms? Okay, we'll put you into groups of 3. Lovely. So welcome back, everyone. What we'd like to do now is just give you the opportunity just to share what went on in your breakout rooms, what insights you might have gained, and any questions or thoughts that may have come up for you. Yeah, Raphael.
Well, in my group, I emerged from my group not with questions, but with a lot of good information. We share about cultural background and how we manage our different personalities or different way of how we lead to the lifestyle or background, cultural background, formal knowledge, even worldview. This was so interesting conversation.
We also discussed culture and different roles that we may play either at home, at work, or at school, or at church, different roles that we may have and how they could be interconnected. And they can also influence each other, I think, also. So like, we were talking like motherhood, right? You can be a nurturer at work or in other roles in the community, not just at home with your own children. So we were discussing how, that plays out in our lives. So it was really interesting conversation.
And Joanne, did that idea of multiplicity, multiple cells, was it making sense? Did it make sense?
So yes, and then we came to the conclusion that at some point we have to be able to know who's leading all those cells, right? And then we came to the conclusion that it's our values, our belief systems that guides us, and in the way that we ultimately you know, lead our lives, right? And we have to make a conscious decision. Are we going to be toxic people in this world? Or are we going to be positive people in this world? So there's a lot of interplay there, but there's always that self that is leading it at some point, right? And so it takes reflection, and so that's what I was saying, that as I've matured in my life and different practices that I do, I've had to check myself, let's put it that way, just to keep it short, like just like in reflecting, like, is my shadow self leading this behavior in this situation, or is it my positive self, right? And then aligning myself back to my values. If it's not matching, then I have to correct it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Oh, Susan, we'll come to you in just a moment. There's lots of different theories of multiple selves, and one theory which resonates for me, and it sounds like it resonates for you, is that there is an overall narrator or an orchestrator who's kind of managing the whole show. There's another theory that says, well, there is no narrator. It's just like one self will pop up and then another self will pop up, and they need to kind of work amongst themselves. So there's two quite different sets of theories there. So Susan, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to mention, we talked a bit about how different parts of us have to some degree different value systems. It depends on our situation. If you know, if we're standing at a podium versus in a graveyard at midnight, there's different parts of ourselves that are called up, and that we can feel the conflict inside. And we talked a little bit about the theory of disowned selves, which you may be familiar with, and how as a leader it's important to get in touch with the parts of ourselves that we would like to deny or dislike, because when we meet those reflections of those disowned selves in other people, it can cause a big barrier unless we're really in touch with those parts of us. So I particularly talked about, I realized that having been brought up in a very patriarchal culture and family, that I had an inner misogynist that I really don't like, and I don't want to have active, and I don't want to admit to. And I absorbed some of that belief system. And so if I am talking to somebody who discusses, you know, strongly negative attitude towards women, rather than trying to connect, I will fight unless I can accept that reflection in me, which then makes me curious instead of resistant. Wow.
Yeah. So much in that. I love your piece around the values piece. So it's like, as I said, my kind of action self is really driven to get things done. My loving self has quite different values, but the question then becomes, well, how can they get on with each other rather than ignore each other, which takes us to a fundamentally different definition of authenticity, because authenticity through that lens is the extent to which I know myself, they understand each other, and they get on together. They're able to collaborate. So the values piece, they may have different values, but ultimately you're wanting them to kind of align around a way of being. And I love your story about the inner misogynist, because one of the premises, or it's a really challenging thought, is that every single one of our inner selves has our best intentions at heart, in mind, which says you're And I found that really challenging when I was listening about your inner misogynist, because I thought, well, how could that self be useful? But then you were talking about connecting with misogynism. I don't know, maybe there's a piece there around just being able to connect with people. I don't know. Well, what do you think about that? I mean, does your inner misogynist have anything to bring to the party? Is there, what value, how does it, I'm really curious, how does it, what does it see its role being in terms of helping you?
Absolutely. I believe all my inner selves have value, and that their one sort of prime directive, to bring up like a Star Trek reference, is to protect me,
Right.
the integrated whole.
Yeah.
So if my inner misogynist wants to protect me from criticism, attack, harm by men.
Right.
So when that part of me arises, I shrink and become very small.
Yeah.
And I zip my lips and I stop being the intellectual, opinionated Susan, and that protects me from from direct attack. And I have to have a conversation with that part of me and say, thank you so much for coming up and reminding me that this is a worldview that many people have, and you have a slice of. And how do I navigate through this in a way which I take your intention to heart, but not the explicit command to remain silent?
Wonderful. Yeah, great. Any other thoughts or questions or insights? Lots of appreciation for you, Susan.
Paul, I was just hoping Raphael could say a bit more about the culture conversation, because I feel like that's also really relevant. Both Raphael and Joanne talked about that. Raphael, do you mind expanding a bit more on that conversation?
Let me ask the instructor. Will you allow me, Paul, to talk about?
Yeah, please. Yeah, definitely.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for asking. First of all, for me, it was an honor to have a conversation with Dara and Susan. Thank you, Susan, for instructing me today. Yes, the cultural background and have a tremendous influence. And I discussed with Susan particularly about Latinos, how we lead, and how we think, and how our worldview influence us. I told Susan that I grew up in a rural area at the Dominican Republic, and even though I have a master's degree, PhD, and be involved in academic area, I still have some myths from my rural area that I struggle with. It is not easy to switch paradigms because the cultural paradigms tied us, in my experience, and it's like holding me back. I had to battle with that myths and traditions, even though there are, as I told Susan, there are clean culture or clean traditions, but there are traditions that in reality it doesn't make sense. For instance, I mentioned that in my rural area of the Dominican Republic, people of my generation, they don't walk by themselves outside at the cemetery area at midnight because we were in danger finding their body in the cemetery or their body come out and touch it to us. That's sorry, I'm mute.
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Yes, and for instance, in my research or my doctoral dissertation, and research different leaders with different leaders, interview different leaders in the Midwest and here in the United States about how we lead or how they lead in their organizations and churches. And what I found is that all the leaders, all the participants are leading based on their leadership they learned from parents in Latin America, or government system, or cultural background. Even though they say, I don't like to lead as the government in my home country. With my analysis, I found that, yes, they have. I found some different leadership style. And in general, there are a predominant leadership style that all those leaders had in the way they're leading that globe named as a power distance leadership. Because in Latin America, we are power distance. We have this kind of leadership. Is that right, Joanne? Joanne, are you from Latin America? You are mute. Yes, we have this kind of leadership. Also, another thing is the versus individualism. We are collectivists in Latin America, and we lead as taking into account that we have this kind of leadership in mind, and we have this kind of paradigms and kind of worldview and mentality. Yes, at the end, culture influence the way that we lead. Thank you, Susie, for asking.
Thank you, Rafa. I'm conscious we've got about 4 minutes. So, Suze, I'm going to hand over to you just for the last piece.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I just think those conversations lend, I mean, the beautiful insights from everybody. We appreciate you so much going on the journey with us. And there's so much more to be said. Paul and I wanted to finish the session really about taking an organizational lens around how do you sort of design interventions? What does this mean around multiple cells? And for OD practitioners, which some of you may be, how do you actually get clear on one of the first points we've said, Paul, if you can put up, is the idea of where do you stand on the nature of self? And as we've heard from Susan and Raphael and Joanne, you know, there's very different lenses, ways in which we can view those different selves, where they're formed, where they come from. And we think that that actually changes the conversation around leadership development. And certainly the idea of, in leadership development programs, really just floating the idea of multiplicity. You can hear in the conversation we just had that it opens up beautiful dialogue around inclusion, around culture, you know, much more inclusive for individuals and teams to engage in these types of conversations together. And then we think about it more from a strategic point of view of how do you ensure as an OD practitioner or organizational change agent that you're strategically deploying this concept, that aligns to some of the other work that you may be doing in your organization, particularly as we've heard from the group, that idea that we're redefining authenticity, that perhaps authenticity is better defined as how well yourselves know each other, to Susan's point, how yourselves can lean in and help one another, to Raphael's point about how yourselves are formed really early on and how that shows up in your leadership. Such a powerful discussion, and at risk of perhaps being at conflict with other programs that you might be running, which leads me to the fourth point about guiding the reflective process. Joanne, you landed on that in your comments. Really the importance of helping our leaders and helping our leadership programs integrate meaningful reflection. Most good leadership programs have reflection at the, as part of the components of the program, but Paul and I would suggest that this sort of lens requires us to really help guide the reflective process, to get clearer on what good reflection looks like and the types of questions that we can be asking ourselves and each other in more reflective sort of conversations. And in line with that is the last point. Paul and I are passionate advocates of group coaching. We coach groups around the world. And the richness, even this little snippet that we've had with each of you today, the richness that leaders get from being able to really leverage each other's insights in a group coaching format, we think is a core aspect of the future of leadership development and those interventions that are going to be sustainable into the future. So I suppose, in closing, we're right on the closing time. For us, these 5 mantras, we hope that we've given you a sense today of how to begin to make them accessible for yourselves and for the leaders that you work with. I want to draw anyone's attention to, I will be at the conference next Friday presenting on the reflective learning aspect of this model, really tying into the piece about what quality reflection might look like and how we can help guide that better for leaders and in leadership development. And in closing, Paul and I would just love to say thank you for today. We are really keen to continue this dialogue around making wisdom more practical and accessible. You have our contact details there. We would love to hear from you. And we will also, as we said, the book will be published early in the new year. So we look forward to sharing that with everybody as well. Paul, if you want to just close us out.
I'd just reiterate what you said, Susie. Look, thank you ever so much for coming and playing with us, and particularly thank you for sharing so much in the little plenary session we just had after the exercises. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, everybody.